Hi, everyone. I'm Kate Merrill, and I am a researcher at the University of Illinois, Chicago. And I have been working with community-based organizations in Chicago, and we are working on adapting a sexual and reproductive health program for Latina teens and their female caregivers. And then we are going to run a pilot factorial trial of the adapted intervention. And so it's in partnership with community-based organizations again. And we have been going through kind of this whole, the preparation phase, and we'll be doing a small pilot this summer, but then gearing up for a pilot factorial trial. My question really has to do with sample size, and also, well, I guess it's mostly also just thinking about the logistics of how it's going to work with the randomization procedures. And so I thought that it might be easiest just to share my screen and trying to kind of work through. So just to also say, with the way that we're going to run the workshops is that, which is the curriculum, we've broken it into 4 sessions. One session is going to be our constant component that everyone will get. And then we have 3 other sessions, which are our 3 components that we'll be testing. And I've been also working with John Ziak, whom I know has already worked with Linda and Kate and others on kind of like power calculations for the MOST framework. And so he's just been also helping me just try to think about power. And another just note is that for the pilot factorial trial, it will be a pilot. So again, we won't be fully powered to detect effects, but I would love to try to do the randomization the same way that we would for, like an R01, hopefully in the future. And so essentially what I think that we will end up doing is, so using within cluster randomization. So we would be randomizing teen girls and their female caregivers as a pair. We would randomize them regardless of their membership in the community partner organization, because we'll have multiple partners. But then the main thing is that we would randomize groups of the dyads. So essentially, let's say our first site recruits 4, pairs, then they would be our first group, and then we would randomize them to, they would be randomized to like condition 6. Then the second site recruits 3 dyads, and they would be randomized to maybe condition 4.
Can you explain why you're doing that?
So the randomizing the groups of dyads, it's really just with trying to think about the feasibility of how this is going to look in practice with the organizations doing the recruitment and running the sessions. And so the thinking is that if, for one, we would like all of the organizations to get experience running all of the components as implementers, because we are hoping to also create a program that will be like sustainable over time. And then if, just in terms of, they also will be able to recruit, there will be differences a little bit in terms of how sites are able to recruit. And like for some sites, it's easier to recruit than others. And so, by being able to say to them, okay, recruit enough to host a workshop, and then we'll randomize them, then that's kind of like, I think what would be most feasible for
I think I'm missing something here, Kate. Is the treatment delivered in a group setting?
Yes, it's delivered in a group setting.
That's hugely important. Sorry.
Okay. Yeah.
You know
Yeah.
that?
Sorry for not clarifying that.
didn't know
It's a group workshop. So
I did not know that. All right.
yeah. No, thank you for asking. So yeah, so it's a group workshop, and so basically the teens and the caregivers come to the site, and with other teens and caregivers, and then there are facilitators that lead the workshops, and then we're just random, we're whichever condition they're randomized to affects like which content they receive.
And it sounds like it's not hugely important that you have a certain number of people or dyads in each group. It sounds like there's a range there, but it's going to go kind of by. And I understand this. I imagine you don't want people to wait to be brought into the study and then wait weeks before they can get into a group. So.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Yeah, and when I spoke to John just about how big the groups should be, if just thinking about study power, he was saying that if we're doing group randomization, you ideally want the groups to be as small as possible for the study power. And I actually think that it works well for the feasibility also, because to your point, a site, if they can, what we found in the past with other versions of this program is that we want to have at least 3 pairs of teens and caregivers. So if they can recruit, 3 to 5 is what we're thinking, then they would get randomized to a condition. And so this is kind of my conditions image, and then and because the conditions are also either on or off, so people either get a component or they don't, and what we're tentatively thinking is running is like aiming to have about 10 dyads per condition, and then I thought this might be the easiest way to show what I talked about with John, the statistician, what this would look like in practice is that he said you can kind of think of it as having randomization blocks, but you only have like a couple of blocks. So essentially in your first block, you're trying to get enough dyads randomized to all 8 conditions. So, let's say site A, they recruit 4 dyads, and then maybe they're randomized to condition 6, and then site B recruits 3, they're randomized to condition 7. So you run workshops to fill all the 8 conditions. And then once you're done with that, then you do another block. And so you kind of start over again and randomize people to the conditions. And then, I guess the benefit there is what I've realized though is that in practice, the tricky part also is that it's hard to know how many people you recruit. A certain number of people, but we can't only recruit 3 dyads and assume that all 3 are going to show up. So I think we need to recruit 5 and hope that 3 show up. So any workshop might have between 3 and 5 dyads. So in practice, what I'm envisioning is that if we do this with let's say we go through two rounds of the randomization, maybe in condition 1, you end up with 8 dyads who've completed it. Condition 2 have 8, condition 3 might have only 7, so you end up with like slightly different numbers across the conditions. I think that's just sort of I don't think there's any way around that, I guess. And my, again, and I think, again, the benefits, I think we've talked about a lot of the benefits, but again, all the sites get experience running the conditions, and then the participants can just travel to their own community organization to get their condition. One of John, the statistician, said he likes this block idea because it avoids confounding with time, because you randomize to all the 8 conditions, then you randomize to the 8 conditions again. So you're kind of so that's a benefit. And then I think it could also help avoid contamination because people are probably less likely to kind of talk about what they're learning outside of their group, but at least they're randomized to the same condition as a group. But then there would be some variation between the conditions. But basically, that's kind of what I'm thinking about, and just wanted to see does this randomization approach make sense? And another thing that I actually realized recently, I haven't talked to the statistician about, is that our primary outcome is going to be reducing risky sexual behavior, but that's typically only measured among teens who have had sex, and not all participants will have. So I'm realizing I have to kind of figure out how that affects power. But I guess maybe I can just stop there and see if there's any feedback.
Can you back up a couple of slides? Show me the permuted blocks again. Yeah, okay. So just looking at this, I'd have to really sit down and look at it, but you have 4 sites on this, right? A, B, C, D? Okay. And do you have every experimental condition represented within each site? Is that the plan?
Yes. I guess that the plan I'm thinking is that all sites would be trained on, and prepared to run any of the conditions. And then it just depends on when they recruit, what condition their dyads are recruited to. That would just
you can't do it that way. You need to talk to John about this, John Ziak about this, because there's basically, there's 2 primary ways, and not the only ways, but 2 primary ways to do random assignment when you have clustering, which you have here. One is, and you know this already, I'm just kind of reviewing this for the other people who are on the webinar. There's within cluster and between cluster randomization, right? So, but with between cluster randomization, you're randomizing entire clusters to conditions. You're not doing that here. But you also are not doing within cluster randomization, Kate, because if you do within cluster randomization, you're replicating the entire experiment within each cluster, and that evidently is not what you're doing here. So you could, I guess what I'm saying is I encourage you to pay more attention to that. You seem to have decided you would kind of let the chips fall where they may with that, and that's not a good idea. You have to control that one way or another. So you can discuss that with John Ziak. There's different ways to do it. One way you can do it is to try and set things up so that you do end up with the entire experiment replicated within each site. You don't necessarily have to do that. If you look in the edited book, Collins and Kugler, I'm pretty sure that, there's a chapter on there on nesting, multi-level situations where, and we talk about random assignment in that. And there are ways to kind of do something that's in between. And John was one of the authors on that, so he'd be a great person to talk to about this. But anyway, you really can't. My message is not so much that you have to do one thing or another, just that you can't let the chips fall where they may. You have to decide in advance what you're going to do.
I think
okay.
But Kate, one of the other variables, and we'll wrap up your question in just a second here, but you have a finite number of potential participants at each site, and you're also trying to retain some participants for your bigger trial, right?
Possibly, yeah. It's just that they might also age out of the study, but otherwise, yes.
And we don't know anything about how they're going to be recruited. And so Linda's totally right. But I think there's also this practical, you don't know what it's going to be like to recruit people from these sites either.
Well, and it's a pilot, so that's perfect. And that's really great. I applaud you for wanting to pilot test your random assignment procedure. That's a really, really good idea. That's really great that you're doing that. I just want to comment that we probably don't have time to talk about this right now, but I would love to know more about what you mean by the term pilot study, because I find when I talk to 10 different people, I get 10 different answers about what they mean by pilot study. And I think in the field, we need a definition of the pilot study. I mean, there are different definitions, and different people use different definitions, but we all use the same term, pilot study. There ought to be like a type 1 pilot and a type 2 pilot and a type 3 pilot, but we don't really have that. And then the other thing I want to say is I really encourage you to think through it. At the end, you kind of casually said, well, then another thing we have to think about is the outcome is only relevant for people who've had sex. That's huge. That's just enormous. And you really, really, really need to think about that. Yeah. So anyway, I mean, I would encourage you to think of either. I mean, I guess you can't really make that an exclusion criterion. That would be too
but
uncomfortable.
It could be like it matters, where you're going to use a more proximal outcome as what you're going to use to decide your optimized intervention.
Yeah.
And then you can look at that outcome among those who've had sex. That's what I would do.
Like risk of risky sex,
Yeah.
something like that.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
And
Okay, great.
That's one reason why we encourage people to develop a careful conceptual model, because this is a perennial problem in prevention. Because you have to wait for the risky behavior, whatever it is, to happen, and if it's youth, that can take a while.
Mm-hmm.
So it's better to have some more proximal outcome.
Great.
Kate, thank you for sharing and coming so prepared with slides. Mackenzie, is your hand raised as a question for Kate, or do you want to ask something different?
I was going to comment on Kate's study, but if we need to move on, I don't want to hold us back. I can message Kate on the side.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Kate. Carly.
Hi, I'm Carly Murphy. I am a clinical psychologist by training and currently an instructor at Wake Forest University School of Medicine. And I have a K99R00 that uses the MOST framework. And I'm in the process of writing my application to transition to the R00 phase. So what I initially proposed was basically 2 aims in the K99 phase that were firmly situated in the preparation phase of MOST. So now I'm starting to think about what was the 3rd aim there, which I kind of have the opportunity to expand into 3 aims now in the R00 phase. And one of the things that I'm really thinking about, so the intervention that I've developed and will be testing is a digital intervention. It's fully self-guided, delivered via a website. And something that I think is really tricky right now in that digital mental health intervention space is the concept of engagement or intervention use. So one of the things that I'm struggling with is I have a conceptual model I can share where to kind of place engagement in this model. And I've also considered the possibility of adding kind of a 5th intervention component that is targeting engagement, which I think could change where I place that in this model. But I think I've really struggled with that because I think it could be important to have some sort of wraparound almost intervention that promotes engagement. So having them do like a weekly check-in with a coach or something like that to help set goals for what they want to complete in the digital tool for the next week. But that, like, it doesn't make sense to add in that intervention kind of, in the same line as these and then place engagement here, because really what we're targeting with that is engagement with these intervention components. So I'm curious if you have any wisdom to share about how people have conceptualized this in digital interventions in the past, this concept of engagement and potentially wraparound interventions.
Yeah, this reminds me of Michael Lorber's study. So, I mean, I have an opinion about this. Your opinion may be, why don't you go, Kate?
No.
It might be different from
You go.
Okay. So I love the idea of thinking of engagement as a separate intervention because its outcome is engagement.
Right.
Now, some people disagree with me on that, and I think a case can be made for the other, for their perspective too. I had this argument with I don't mean it was an argument, but we went back and forth about this with someone I was collaborating with a number of years ago. So the way I would think of this is as a separate intervention on engagement with its own conceptual model.
Mm.
So, the question here is, what do you do to promote engagement? And then the outcome, engagement, then the way I see it would interact with behavioral activation, cognitive restructuring, mindfulness training, positive psychology interventions, kind of in an activation sense, the idea that if you don't have engagement, then you might as well not have behavioral activation. So that's my feeling about this, but I really do think a case can be made for another perspective on engagement. And I'm not sure that my perspective on that necessarily fits with, every single intervention. I think it fits okay with yours.
So Carly, okay, my inclination is you don't know about your website and engagement at all right now, right? And I personally would find it very difficult to operationalize a discrete component because you don't really know how behavioral activation is going to go. You don't really. So I'm thinking, given that this is your R00 phase, you keep this conceptual model and you collect the heck out of the engagement data. And I mean, in a post hoc analysis, you can look at all of how engagement relates to those different things. If there's different engagement rates by experimental condition, I just think thinking one step forward, if you go through the optimization trial and you eliminate one or two of your components, but you have this engagement part, at this point, I feel like that could get a little messy. And I think I'm just trying to think of your first research question. So that would be my perspective.
Well, that's a really good point. That maybe it's a little bit premature to think about engagement.
Because I think that's the beauty of most, and I know Carly, you are all in, but that's, something about an optimization objective moving forward. It's something about the next, continual optimization paradigm here. It's once we get this website to work, we know that it affects depressive symptoms, then let's get people to actually use it. And I know that that's prolonging the process. I just feel like we don't know too much about your intervention just yet.
Right. Yeah. And I think the place where I get stuck with that is if people don't use it, can we tell if it actually works? It's almost like a chicken and egg problem where it's okay, yes, of course, the first step is to see if this works, but we have to get people to use it to see if it works. So I wonder if conceptualizing this engagement piece, making it part of the study rather than a part of the intervention in a sense, retention strategies. Yeah. Okay.
I feel Carly, you have an opportunity here to run this, right? So your R00 is it a pilot optimization trial? It's fully.
It's full.
Okay, but great. Then you can use all of that. You could look at the amount of time it takes each one of your experimental conditions to complete the intervention, where a drop-off point is, and then that informs a engagement component for the next round. That's my opinion.
But just to argue with you about that.
I love it.
I think Carly is saying she's concerned that what if engagement is really low, and then that will completely mess up her study? Then she won't have
Yes.
I mean, yeah. It just seems
So Kate doesn't care if that happens or not.
Of course I care, but like, isn't that the thing that like interventions deal with? And yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's kind of a new problem in some ways it's like a new version of an old problem of engagement. I just feel like with being trained as a clinical psychologist, where you've got people coming in every week to do an intervention, part of it is like me letting go of control with this digital intervention and not seeing people in person ever. And part of it is also that there is some data to show that this is a particularly problematic issue with this population of adolescent and young adult cancer survivors who have a lot of competing commitments. So the whole idea behind this intervention is that is available on demand so they can do it whenever they want to. But I mean, I can speak to my own experience and also speak to the literature, those things that you want to do and sound like a really great idea and never quite get to. And I'm a little bit concerned that this intervention is going to fall in that area. But I think you're right that that's data ultimately. And that would give us, important data to serve as preliminary data for, okay, we need to go back to the preparation phase and think about this engagement piece before we can really tell if this intervention actually works.
Okay, so then if you mean that, Carly, if you really mean that, then let me suggest a radically different approach here.
Uh-oh.
Kate heard me say that to so many people. So I'm going to suggest, just to throw this out for your consideration, that you do not use most here. Instead, you put together an intervention that has all 4 of those components in it as a treatment package, but you're not going to evaluate this intervention. Instead, you're going to develop a conceptual model of engagement, and that's going to have a number of different components, and you're going to test the wraparound intervention.
So you started with don't do most, and I was like, are you okay?
I ended up, she's still doing most, just on a different aspect of the problem. Because about 3 or 4 times while we've been talking, Carly, and sometimes I feel like a little bit like a psychotherapist when I talk with people. What I hear you saying is that I'm not comfortable testing this in an optimization trial until I can give it a fair test when I feel like I've got the engagement thing nailed down. And you are not alone.
Yeah.
Kate and I talked to a lot of people who are doing mHealth type interventions, and everyone is struggling with this. And I predict in the next couple of years there's going to be a lot of literature on this because people are starting to do studies on just on things that will improve engagement, adherence, and compliance. And I think there's just a wide open area. So you could do a really interesting study, but I emphasize this would require you going back to the drawing board and developing a serious conceptual model of what will predict engagement.
And I think that's really tricky with the place I'm in professionally, just as far as like this grant mechanism where we have some latitude to change things, but this was like already proposed and approved by the NCI. So I don't know how they would take that, but I do think that would be a really interesting simultaneous study, perhaps, where we could take this intervention and it doesn't have to be randomized like this. Like that could be a separate study that I do with different funding that I don't necessarily have to wait for this study to be done to do. So I think that makes a lot of sense.
But okay, so radical 1, radical 2 over here, if you did choose to make a engagement related component. Annie does offer that, like, that's a good goal of the preparation phase, and maybe that could be used to inform the development of a component. I'm thinking about you and how you might operationalize engagement, because I think it will be really different for different experimental conditions, and I think that could be tricky. Well, I look forward to thinking more about this with you.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to the class later this month.
Awesome. All right, Carly, thank you for sharing your idea. Do you feel like we've sufficiently covered what you need from us right now?
Yeah, lots of food for thought. Thank you.
Yeah.
And as Kate says, you can get back to it in the training in a couple weeks.
Yeah. Okay. So, John, I'm going to read your question out loud, but feel free to, if you'd like to ask it, you can. Okay. So preparation phase for what will culminate in a SMART trial for physical activity adherence for adults with obesity. Theory base is social determination theory, right? SDT. Okay. I am currently piloting the grassroots intervention components using N of 1 trials to uncover the best mixture of active components to support the cultivation of intrinsic motivation towards physical activity. Question A is whether we've heard of anyone using N of 1 trials to build a SMART trial. Would we advise this approach? John knows that N of 1 trials are conceivably comparable with RCTs if done excellently, but I think there's too much complexity and unknowns to put that rigor into current piloting. I don't know. Do we know of any N of 1s?
It's so interesting that this should come up now, because I was just talking yesterday. I had lunch with a biostatistician here at NYU, and I was talking with her about N of 1 trials. But I'll come back to that in a moment. But John, I feel like there's a couple things going on in your question. And one of them is pilot study versus confirmatory trial or even optimization trial. It sounds like you're in a pilot phase now. You're in the preparation phase. So you can do anything. I mean, anything is fair game for the preparation phase. It doesn't have to be rigorous necessarily. It just has to get the job done for finding out what you need to know. So yeah, N of 1 trials, absolutely. And I actually think that would be an interesting thing to write up as a paper, using N of 1 trials in the preparation phase of most. I think that's interesting, and I think completely justified under the circumstances. And yeah, I think that's a really great idea. If you were asking me about N of 1 trials as an optimization trial, that's a different thing. And that's what I was talking with the biostatistician about. And that is undeveloped at this point. I wouldn't say don't do it, but that would be breaking new ground.
So John's example here is about a SMART for the optimization trial. Does your belief about N of 1s hold for a fixed intervention or a factorial experiment? Okay.
Yeah, in fact, I think N of 1 trials have a lot of potential in situations where it's hard to get a lot of subjects. There are some situations where, like prevention of rare diseases or treatment of rare diseases, or when you're working with very specialized populations like people with autism, it can really be hard. Even with a lot of resources, it can be hard to get, like 100 subjects. I mean, I've talked with people who work in autism, and they say that their whole field is based, any experiment in their field is based on maybe like 30 people. That's like the max that you could expect. And so I think I felt for a while that there's a need for an approach to optimization trials that would be based on a smaller N. But I mean, it's one thing to identify a need, it's another thing to have an answer to it. And I identified the need, big deal. That was kind of obvious, but what to do is not so obvious. But I did think that N of 1 might be a possibility there. Anyway, but I think what you're doing sounds great. Go for it.
Thank you very much.
Write it up. We look forward to reading it.
Yeah, right, and write it up because I think it's interesting. Why am I saying that? Write it up because I think it's interesting. Therefore, you should write it up.
Okay, Carly, yes, there is a trial that's happening right now at NYU that is engagement focused, and the PI of that is Michael Lorber, Lorber. To my knowledge, there is yet to be something published on that.
He's not published a protocol paper, right?
It hasn't, no. So Carly, we are both on that project, and if you'd like to be connected, just let me know.
Yeah, I'm sure he'd be happy to talk with you. He's very open to talking about it.
Cool, just send me an email.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Anne Marie, you said you were also interested in engagement. Did you have another take on engagement? Oh, just listening. Thank you. Love that you're here. So no questions. Anyone else have questions?
Or comments?
Yeah.
Or arguments. Does anybody want to argue with us? I love to argue. Does anybody want to argue with us about anything?
This is Linda's dream.
I know it's my dream that somebody will argue with me about. All I hear about is comments people make when I'm not around. I would love to. If anyone has any doubts about most, I would love to argue with you. I promise not to be mean.
You wouldn't be mean.
I wouldn't be mean.
Can I ask a question? Carly, thank you so much for sharing the engagement. I'm much earlier in processing a K, but engagement for exactly the reason you said, same population that you're talking about, was one of the outcomes. And so in my case, I wanted to see if the use of physical activity encouraged engagement in their own survivorship care. But then, as you guys know, I kind of had this optimization. So it is making me wonder at this early stage, would you guys do a small pilot, not most oriented first, and then do it? I'm not as, obviously Carly's already done with her KN99.
Here, the word that's going to come out of Linda's mouth is potentially, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, since you can read my mind, why don't you just go ahead?
I think if
my mind.
Okay, so I think, Anne Marie, it depends on what your research question really is here. Is that the next thing that would come out of your mouth?
Yep.
Good. 2 for 2. So I think I don't know. I think you could totally do an engagement related trial first and then go back to it. I struggle with engagement first. Okay, physical activity during chemo what's the best way to support somebody doing physical activity during that time?
Yeah, it's with engagement. This thing with engagement and digital interventions, it's really, really important, and it's really, really hard, and it's totally a chicken and egg problem.
I feel like you got to know where the sticky points are for engagement in order to then design the intervention. And I think there's theory, there's other papers, there's plenty of things you could think about and pilot and develop something, but specific to your intervention, your population, potentially you don't have that information yet.
So what are the alternatives? Let's kind of lay out some of the alternatives. You can let the chips fall where they may about engagement and conduct an optimization trial on the intervention. You can you can pretend that you like the intervention the way it is and just give it to everybody and conduct an engagement, a trial on engagement. Or you can potentially find a way to integrate the two, although that would assume that particular modes of encouraging engagement are not linked to individual components of the intervention, and sometimes they're not. So if that's the way it is, then that would, then you could do that. You could look at, like, let's say, for example, you had 4 intervention components you wanted to look at, and then you had 2 engagement components. That would be 6 components. And you could, well, first of all, it's a digital intervention, so you can have a lot of, you can probably manage a lot of experimental conditions. Or if you can't manage all that many, that would be 2 to the 6. So that would be, I don't know, a lot of what is 128? 128? No, 64. That's 64 experimental conditions, which is a lot. But again, I mean, if it's just a programming issue, that would be hard, but you could do it and then it would be done. Or you could consider a fractional factorial design that would reduce the number of experimental conditions. There's very nice fractional factorial designs that would reduce it to 32 or even 16, depending on how far you're willing to go. So I see those as those are the 3 main alternatives. Focus on the intervention and maybe include some stuff that you think is going to encourage engagement as constant components. Make the intervention, that's A. B, make the intervention kind of a constant component and just look at engagement, or look at components of both.
I think that when you have more information, it opens up other creative opportunities. And she's on the call, but not expecting her to respond right now. But I think there is a way to have components that are both like content related and engagement related, and then have 2 outcomes that are both effectiveness and engagement or implementation related. And so stay tuned for Jillian and Kate thinking more about that.
Oh, that's a good idea. Yeah, you could do that. That's kind of like merging 2 components that in some ways you would rather have be separate, but for this kind of application, I totally agree that it would make perfect sense to combine them. I think that's a really great idea.
September 1st, we will get to that. Okay, Mackenzie has a question. Mackenzie is interested in matching people to treatment based on baseline characteristics that are associated with engagement in and outcomes from a fixed intervention. What study designs other than a SMART are open for moving this towards an adaptive intervention?
So that's what we sometimes call a matched adaptive intervention and not a time varying adaptive intervention, right, Mackenzie? Yeah. Yeah, that actually would, I think, be a standard, factorial experiment, but with restricted randomization, maybe. So what's the question that you want to answer, Mackenzie?
Basically we have these baseline characteristics. We know they're associated with engagement and outcomes based off of both quantitative and qualitative data. We have a kind of our best guess of who needs what, but we want to test that. And so, is that a SMART trial, or is that, we go ahead and match person A to intervention A and person B to intervention B, but then that doesn't tell us if A is better than B for person A, right?
No, it doesn't. It doesn't tell you that. So it sounds like what you want to do is you have characteristic A, right? And you're wondering for people who are, let's say people can be high or low on characteristic A. So you're wondering, and maybe you have 2 different versions of the intervention or an intervention component. So you're wondering, for person A, is version 1 or version 2 better? And for someone who's high on A, is version 1 or version 2 better? For someone who's low on A, is version 1 or version 2 better?
Right.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So that would be you could just block on being high or low on that characteristic, and then depending on what you're doing, you could replicate, if you had a number of different components, you could replicate the whole optimization trial, for people who are high and people who are low. And that would answer the question of which components are better for people who are high versus people who are low.
Mm-hmm. So is that, I mean, I think there are questions about varying it over time. So like then, we would have those subsequent randomizations for responders versus non-responders, but just setting that aside, kind of the first arm, it's really just like a multi-arm trial where we're blocking our randomization based on our baseline characteristic.
Okay, so you are going to change it over time.
Potentially.
So why do you not like the SMART trial then?
I like the SMART. I'm convinced on the SMART. My collaborators aren't. So how do I talk them into it?
Oh, your collaborators aren't? Okay, that's a different question from, I would say. I thought you were asking, is there an alternative to the SMART?
I mean, I think the main question is this matching, right? And what I'm hearing from you, as we were saying on this call, is that, if we kind of block randomize, kind of within our baseline characteristics, then it could be a SMART if we're trying to, vary over time, or it could just be a, 2-arm, 3-arm kind of trial.
Yeah, it depends on, I always say it depends on, it's so hard to talk about experimental design in the abstract. It really depends on exactly what are the research questions. And you would be amazed, I think, at just how subtle changes. This is again where I feel like a therapist sometimes. Sometimes I talk to people, do you mean exactly this or exactly this other thing? And to something that is just a little bit different, you can sometimes end up with really different experimental designs being appropriate. So it would just be important to just articulate exactly what the research questions are. I would advise, so here's my advice to you, since you asked. Here's my advice to you. Forget about experimental design. Just forget you ever heard the term experimental design. Just completely remove that from your mind and make a list of the burning scientific questions. And once you have that list, then start thinking about what kind of experimental design you would use.
Makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
She's made me do that too, Mackenzie, don't worry.
Yeah, I mean, I do that myself.
Yeah.
And I think if you approach your collaborators from that perspective, they might be more likely to get on board with a design that's a little different. Is the issue that they are, that they just want to do an RCT?
That seems to be kind of the place where they're coming from, that, if we have all this data to suggest that person high on trait A needs intervention 1, why wouldn't we just, kind of assign them to that? I think they're open to kind of the blocked randomization. Kind of within people high and within people low, we kind of do our randomizations. I'm more interested in kind of the adaptions over time. So I think that's where I've been advocating more for the SMART. But for that matching question, I think there's some debate of kind of what the best way to go about that is.
Yeah, I mean, I think it would be really good to point out to them that if you think that you can successfully match someone at the outset with the right treatment, you're putting a lot of faith in that measure of the trait, whatever the trait is.
Yeah.
That matching, I totally agree that matching can probably be successful for a lot of participants, but it's asking a lot of any measure that we currently have to, I mean, when you think of the reliability and validity of most measures, I mean, for a measure to have 90% reliability and 80% validity, that's outstandingly good. And you would not expect a measure like that to be able to successfully match every single person. So when you think about it, time-varying adaptive interventions, there's kind of a implicit idea. I very rarely hear anybody talk about this but me, about adaptive intervention, so maybe I'm wrong. But I think that with adaptive interventions, there's a trial and error aspect to it. It's kind of like you're saying, well, we don't know everything we need to know to get the right treatment to people. So we'll kind of do what we can at the outset and see how it goes. But then we're willing to change treatment modalities as time goes on, which to me seems like what different people in your team are saying. So it seems like it ought to be a good compromise to say, okay, for you to say, well, I, Mackenzie, like this idea of having an adaptive intervention. The rest of you like this idea of matching. Let's start by matching and we'll follow people. And if the matching wasn't successful, then we'll go, then we have to go to plan B. It seems to me that would be from a sort of success with participants point of view, that would be the way to go. That's what I think anyway.
Thank you.
Other questions?
I can ask another. I have a lot, but one thing I'm curious about is, so I'm thinking about perhaps conceptualizing engagement as a moderator along with other moderators.
Mm-hmm.
And one of my mentors has kind of alluded to the fact that, that can get really tricky with the full factorial trial. So I'm wondering if you have any kind of wisdom to share or resources to share when thinking about moderation analyses in a full factorial trial.
Mm-hmm. Depends on whether you mean moderation where one factor is moderating another factor, or whether you mean moderation where an uncontrolled variable moderates a factor. So if it's moderation within the experiment, that's much simpler. But so which of those do you mean?
The latter, where it's moderation of an uncontrolled factor, not one of the factors we're manipulating.
Yeah. So there's a couple different ways to go about that. Well, you can just kind of let the chips fall where they may about that variable, the uncontrolled variable. And so that has the advantage of being easy. But the disadvantage is that you're not necessarily going to have a lot of power. And the reason is that it's likely the case that the distribution, usually with these kinds of variables, it's a lopsided kind of distribution. And in a case like that, okay, and that's naturally occurring, so that's maybe good. But that you won't necessarily have much power to look at the, it'll be a small effect size. I shouldn't say, it's not like that's not a fault of the design, it would be a small effect size you'd be looking at. If it's something that you're super interested in and you want to invest resources in it, then you could, the way to get the most power is if it's a dichotomous variable, you can then sample so that you have equal numbers in the two categories, and that would get you the most power for looking at the interaction. That's that can be very resource intensive though. Okay. So those are the main ways of dealing with that.
Okay. So perhaps I will not have enough power to do like a fully powered moderation analysis.
There's no reason not to do exploratory analyses though,
right.
after the fact. I mean, I would totally recommend that. And it's not difficult to do those. It's not difficult to interact. It's not, continuous or categorical variable, it's not difficult to do those post hoc analyses. So I would recommend you'll have, if you conduct an optimization trial, fully powered optimization trial, there'll be a ton of interesting exploratory analyses you can do.
Yeah. And I'm thinking about it more from the perspective of framing a kind of a grant application. So thinking about, whether reviewers are going to be concerned, that I'm not fully powered to do the mediation analyses. So yeah, that's helpful.
Well, no, hardly anyone is ever fully powered to do mediation analyses, and yet people do them anyway. And that's not a bad thing. We should be doing mediation analyses. Was there another question?
Yes, but we do not have time. So
Because it's a big question.
it's a big question. And so I'm suggesting it be a Ask Linda for an upcoming newsletter, which leads us to say that we have a new system for emails. And so we will have more newsletter things coming soon. Thanks to our wonderful Gabby. So if you have other questions that you didn't get answered today, I think feel free to send them to us and we can find outlets for them. I did drop a link for a remaining 2 webinars of the spring 23 webinar series. And those are open for registration now. And anything else to say? Thank you all for coming and being here with your questions and being prepared and all of that. All right. Well, I think that'll do it.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.